Hello everyone. Welcome to the mini lecture on Rococo art. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen to this lecture. This will get us back onto schedule and it will complete the class content for all of the slides that you need to study for the second exam. You're about to head off to break, but if you have any questions while you're away, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me by email. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. I wanted to present a bigger picture today because in the next several classes we'll begin to look at a number of different art forms and styles that are produced very rapidly. So if you're paying attention in this class, you'll see that most of our artistic stylistic periods are associated with a century or a century and a half worth of artistic production. We're arriving at a moment in the term where artistic production and advances and changes in styles happen very, very rapidly. So we'll be looking at the Rococo period. We'll define that today, of course, but that dates to more or less 1700 to about 1750. So that's just to make the point that just because 1750 rolls around doesn't mean that people say, oops, time to move on to neoclassical painting. That's just a general, bookend of that time period. Neoclassicism comes onto the scene pretty significantly around 1750 or so, and we would date that till about 1830. Running alongside that is something called Romanticism, and we'll get to that in a couple of different classes, but that will date to the 18th to the early 19th century. This moment, this entire moment that I'm talking about, is a time of extreme change. We're getting into the Industrial Revolution, into revolutions in general, so the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789. These are leading to new enlightened ideals. So a new synthesis of ideas, humanity, reason, nature, and God are all being not reconsidered, but a new synthesis of ideas around those major themes. So we'll talk more about that in the context of this class today and in the following classes together. Geographically, today we're focused in on France, but in short order we'll expand this out to speak about England and then also the east coast of the United States as well. Before we can begin our discussion, we really need to introduce an intellectual debate that was very much a part of the artistic discourse during this time period. And that is the debate between, or kind of comparison between the Poussinnists and the Rubenists. So we've seen Peter Paul Rubens on the right-hand side. Nicolas Poussin was a French artist who was active in Italy, who has a very classical style. So when we bring in the Poussiniste and the Rubenists, what we're actually seeing is an old debate that we've seen before, color versus design, right? Colore versus disegno, as we talked about it in the Italian context. Rubens would fall on the side of color, and Poussin would fall on the side of design. What we'll see for the most part is that the Rococo artists will understand themselves to be followers of Rubens or Rubenists, and the neoclassical artists will understand themselves to be followers of Poussin or Poussinistes. So the Poussinistes were more conservative. They tended to be French artists, and they really defended Poussin's view that drawing should be central, drawing and design should be central to the art-making process. The Rubenists believed, on the other hand, that color, right, was a unifying aspect of art making, that it was superior to design, and so they really paid homage to artists, especially Rubens, and to his really vibrant color palette and loose brushstrokes. So we'll see a number of artists today who seem to align themselves with the style of Rubens. And then in the following class, we'll swing back around and we'll see a number of artists who align themselves with Poussin and his artwork. And also, by way of introduction to the Rococo era, we need to go back to what we might define as France's Baroque period, although you're seeing this as a work by Hyacinthe Rigaud, a very famous portrait of Louis XIV of France, which we would associate with the Baroque era, though the time period, 1701, is really quite late, as Baroque art would relate to an Italian timeline. So here, the extraordinary luxury of Louis the XIV, and of course we know him well to be one of the most luxurious and uh, ostentatious French kings of I suppose up till his time. Louis was known as the Sun King, and so part of in here you'll see this. We'll see this quote in just one moment. But the Sun King, right, which with all the associations of being associated with like the sun, around which I suppose we would today think of everything circulates around the sun. Louis actually in the morning, his entire court would come to his chambers and attend him while he would rise. So the rising of the sun. And then as he would go to bed at night, he would have the entire court assemble around him as he went to bed. He was well known for his beautiful legs. So anytime you see representations of Louis, you'll see the um, the showcasing of these beautiful sort of balletic legs, and we see that here in the Rigaud portrait as well. This portrait is just extraordinary. It's about texture and luxury and richness and fur and royalty, just over and inundating our senses with this sense of luxury. And so here's a quote, a critical quote about Louis and his love for fine things. So here, he likes splendor, magnificence, and profusion in everything. You pleased him if you shone through the brilliancy of your houses, your clothes, your table. Thus, a taste for extravagance and luxury was disseminated through all classes of society, causing infinite harm and leading to general confusion of rank and ruin. So clearly, this is not a positive evaluation of Louis's love for splendor and magnificence. And what we're seeing in this quote is that in instilling this love for luxury throughout all of the classes in France, it was actually degrading them, or this, of course, was the criticism. Louis insisted that the court assemble much more than previous kings had insisted around him during most of the year and at Versailles. So Versailles had been a hunting lodge and now became the central location for the French court. The architecture of Versailles here, if you see this, this is a part of Versailles that was built during this time, designed by Jules Hardouin Mansart and Louis Laveau. So this dates to about 1669 to 85, and I think that you can see in this facade there's a kind of authoritarian architecture that's being put in place by Louis and those around him. What you see here is it's much more classically based than what typical French architecture had been. For Louis, this grandeur and splendor also functioned as a tool of repression, and you see here a more typical bit of sort of French architecture with variety and peaks in the roofs. And for Louis, he was trying to put into place a kind of state style that actually shifted tastes and styles and architectural styles more broadly. Bringing all of the court to Louis at Versailles also broke down some traditional structures of French society. So those nobility had their land holdings throughout France, and the peasants who worked on, so you know, according to this feudal structure, the peasants who worked on that land owed work and food and crops to each member of the nobility, but the nobility also offered them protection. So with so many of the court members circulating and centralized at Versailles, a lot of those traditional structures of society were breaking down in France. To entice the nobility to the court, Louis sort of presented them with all of these luxurious settings. And here, this is very famous, Versailles, the room of mirrors, the Galerie des Glaces, and this plate. So the room itself looks out over the Versailles Gardens, which were highly manicured and just extraordinary vistas were produced. And this is a place where people were seen and saw others. So a place that you would dress in your fanciest garments and be in the fanciest, most luxurious place in probably all of France at that time. So the Hall of Mirrors was just part of a larger effort by Louis to enhance court life and encourage greater attendance at the court by the French nobility. If you look up, you see in this room, you see a famous fresco by Charles Le Brun. So this is in the Hall of Mirrors. It's on the ceiling, and it's the Assumption of the Personal Rule by Louis XIV. I mean, this is some awesome material here. I hope that you haven't missed. Look at Louis bearing his legs front and center. So here, instead of a religious painting, which is what you might expect to see on a ceiling like this, we see a secular painting that positions Louis as this kind of allegorical or as this almost mythological historical figure. And we see Minerva, the patron of learning and arts and also war, who heads up a cast of a bunch of allegorical figures who will instruct and assist Louis in learning about war and learning about intellectual pursuits as well. So here we arrive at what we might more properly call Rococo art on the right. This Alexis Simon Bell work, it's a portrait of Louis XV. If we were together in class today, you know I'd ask you to compare these two works. There is a dramatic shift that has occurred. And I would say that the shift that occurs after the reign of Louis XIV happens, of course, in reaction to and in reaction against the austerity, the heaviness of Baroque art that had been put into place, or that particular style that had been put into place by Louis XIV. So take a look at these two images. On the right hand, we see a much different color palette, more pastel. We have an exterior setting. We have this elegant representation of the king now, who looks more effeminate than the kind of masculine counterpart that we see in Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV. We see again just this sort of light elegance associated with Rococo art. So we'll talk more about the development of Rococo painting, but first we need to talk about architecture, because really interior design and architecture is the birthplace of the Rococo style. We think the word Rococo is actually a combination of the French word rocaille, shell, and barocco, so baroque. And that those two words combined together give us a sense of a new kind of organic, and that's the word shell, form of Baroque austerity. So if we compare these two, what you're looking at right now is the Salon de la Princesse. It dates to 1732 and was produced by the architect and interior designer Germain Boffrand. If we compare these two architectural spaces, they might at first look kind of similar, but they aren't at all. So the Hall of Mirrors on the left is characterized by symmetricality, by repetition of form over and over again. Of course, luxurious materials and textures as well. On the right, if we start to look more closely at the mirrors, for example, there are intentional differences in symmetry. So, which is to say, there is a little bit more organic of a space. The vines, so the sculptural vines that you see here, fall much like actual vines would fall not symmetrically but rather organically. The space itself is much smaller. The scale has actually been reduced. The imagery which we see represented here is quite different in nature than what we've seen in spaces, in Baroque spaces, and particularly in the Hall of Mirrors. One of the most important lessons that I hope we took from Baroque art is that for the most part its purpose was to teach. It had a didactic quality, whether it was a religious story or lesson that was being taught in our Italian context, or even a kind of propagandistic didactic quality in the case of Louis XIV. As we shift into the Rococo era, I would say that painting becomes more decorative. It seems to be subservient to the sculptural elements within the Hotel de Soubise, as you're seeing here. On the right, you see the story of Psyche. And so these are stories that kind of stand alone. They're linked to a narrative, but much less so than those kind of heavy-handed narratives that we became accustomed to in our Italian Baroque context, for example. Here, Psyche is unable to find a lover or a suitor, and we see her sort of exposed on a deserted rock by her father. These are stories of seduction, they're stories of love that are represented, and I think many scholars have wrongly cast Rococo art as feminine. And so, feminine in those terms is very much meant as a critical, right, negative term, in that it has been supposed by some, and again, I say wrongly, that these themes are for purely decorative purposes, that they don't have the same kind of intellectual content that we might have seen in the earlier time period. I hope for the rest of today's lecture we can definitely upend that idea and show you some of the ways that I think Rococo art is really quite radical, and in some ways it is driven by women, by the patronage of women, which that in itself is radical. But certainly the intellectual content of this work is there, is interesting, and is advancing art in some really fascinating ways, and rejecting the politics of the past in some significant ways. That will bring us naturally to the work of Jean-Antoine Watteau, The Pilgrimage to Cythera. This is a work that dates to 1717 and has largely been understood as a landmark painting in the creation of the Rococo style. So in this case, what we're seeing is Watteau, The Pilgrimage to Cythera. It just has a fascinating background. That Watteau he basically in 1709, he won the second prize for entry in the Prix de Rome. The Prix de Rome was a very prestigious state-awarded grant that would basically, the French state would fund a number of artists to go to Italy to study. What they would have to do after this period of study is that they would have to present actually what would be called a presentation piece, a masterwork of sorts. Watteau actually would never end up going to Italy, and they would press him over and over again to present this work nonetheless. He ultimately presents The Pilgrimage to Cythera, and this is a work that it seems was impossible to classify. So as this system would go, you would present a work and then it would be classified according to those painting hierarchies that we've been talking so much about. Was it a history painting? Was it a portrait? Was it a genre painting? And this one seemed to defy those classifications. Instead, it was brought into the royal collection as a fête galante. So a fête galante was a whole new category that was created for this painting, and then many other paintings would be sort of slotted into this category later on. A gallant festivity, that's what the word translates to, scenes of elegant men and women socializing outdoors. You might at first kind of feel like this could be a history painting. This maybe is a narrative that tells us a story, is linked to some kind of text. In actuality, the painting can only be linked to some extent, or only very loosely, to texts or plays that were popular at the time. What we see is the Greek island of Cythera. So this was one that was associated with the island of Aphrodite, who was the goddess of love, and you see representations of sculptures of Aphrodite in this painting. This was a place where emotion could be given free rein, and I think this is really important in French society because of the behavior and societal restrictions that Louis XIV had put into place. People were really quite stifled. This is absolutely true that for nobility, for example, you spent very little time alone every day. You were almost always attended. There were only brief moments, oftentimes in garden spaces. Imagine the gardens of Versailles. You spent only brief moments alone that you had this sort of moment, these moments of privacy. So Cythera, of course, which is an older, mythological idea, still had this idea of a place where you could be free of societal constraints. And so what we see if we look closely at this painting is a group of people. They're almost all in pairs, right? So this is a theme of love. We don't see a specific moment in time, so one that could be specifically linked to a narrative, but rather just the theme and the setting, the outdoor leisure, the pleasure, all associated with love and places where emotion could be given free rein. So speaking of free reign, there are a number of scenes, genres, a whole genre of painting in Rococo art that deals with themes of play and playfulness and childhood and depicts children engaged in adult-like activities or adults engaged in childlike activity. This is a work by Francois Boucher, very famous Baroque artist, that's titled Of These Three Things, What Will You Do For Me? And it dates to about 1733 to 34. This is, you see the two children here, and they're kind of engaged in a game, which it was a popular children's game. There's this sort of distinct sexual undertone to the game, where the boy will say to the girl, of these three things, what will you do for me? And the three things will be, fly to the moon, um, climb the highest mountain in the world, or kiss me. And of course, there's only one of those things that is actually possible. And of course, the girl would have to kiss the boy. And this is a moment where childhood is something that's really being explored as a distinct moment in life, right? And one which is fleeting. I think earlier it had been understood that children were either kind of non-people or small adults, but this is a moment during Enlightenment where intellectuals and are starting to explore the notion of childhood as a distinct phase and a phase where children are more open and capable of love than at any other time in their lives. And thus, adults would use those moments of childhood as places to act out fantasies, right? And so that's what a painting like this would be, the fantasy of being able to just ask for a kiss when one wants one, something that adult societal restrictions would somehow not allow during that time period or would be beyond the bounds of proper decorum. The Rococo emphasis on childhood as a distinct moment in the life of an individual is perfectly expressed in these two works, one by Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, both by Chardin. These are two works. On the left, we see the House of Cards, and we see this child engaged in building a house of cards. I don't know, maybe some of you have done that as children. It requires intense concentration, and at any moment, a gust of wind, a small bump to the table, the entire house of cards, right, could collapse. Similarly, the soap bubble, which dates to 1739, the boy reaches over and he blows this beautiful transparent soap bubble. It's beautiful and perfect and absolutely symmetrical, and in any instant it could just completely burst and disappear. This is likened to this idea of childhood, right? Childhood is this autonomous and positive moment in an individual's lifespan, but which at any moment, right, the coming of age, becoming an adult, childhood just slips away. And so, again, in both of these cases, as with our earlier example by Boucher, we see artists who are exploring notions of like how children never outgrow the love of the game. Right? If you have any younger siblings or have spent time around children, they could play games forever and they could continue to ask questions for seemingly endless time periods. And they don't have the same kind of restrictions that adults impose upon themselves and are imposed upon adults. And now we come to our last painting to talk about today, Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing. This is a piece that dates to 1763. It's just so fantastic, and so many students are really enthralled with this particular work, and I think with great reason. Here we see adults, but they are imposed in this childhood or this childlike game, similar to what we've just talked about, although we've seen children featured in those last paintings. Here we see a man who seems to have fallen to the ground and a woman who swings. Behind her in the background, you see another man who is swinging the swing for her. And off to the left hand of the painting, we see a sculpture, and the sculpture holds, or the sculpted Cupid holds his finger to his lips in a gesture to be quiet. And this Cupid, which is of course a real sculpture, or a painted reproduction of a real sculpture, gives us a hint as viewers that something is going on that this couple doesn't want others to know about. Maybe it's a clandestine meeting. Maybe they're married and this is an extramarital affair. There's all kinds of ways that we could conjure up that this is a secret encounter. We as viewers almost get a glimpse of what he on the ground sees. From his position, he's completely enthralled. He sees up the skirts of this lady as she swings. And swinging, to be clear, would have been associated with the sexual act. It was very much written as an analog or a metaphor for the sexual act. So if you can't see this detail well, it's the bottom detail on the right. There's a little dog frantically barking in this scene. So here we have the appearance of Fido again, and Fido seems to alert our attention, much like the whispering Cupid, that something here is not quite right. There's a one more pretty awesome sign that something is not quite right. So enthralled with looking up her skirts, we see the shoe of the swim, which has flown off. And if you follow the natural course of the shoe, it'll come clunking down and knock this guy on the head. So a kind of tongue-in-cheek insider kind of humor, because he doesn't realize that it's going to happen because he's so focused on this woman and his sexualized gaze at this woman. So we will come back in the next class and just briefly recap some of the key stylistic features of the Rococo era, but I think you want to think of them as lighter themes, themes which probe social restrictions and trying to lift those social restrictions, at least in a painted space, if not in reality. Lighter color palettes, pastel color palettes are pretty common. Feminine scenes by way of scenes that are dealing with women and their kind of daily lives and their gallant festivities, themes that explore notions of childhood and fleeting moments of childhood. And so these are all themes that we'll recap again at the beginning of next class. Don't forget, you have your exam first thing at the beginning of class next time. Shoot me an email if you have any questions that you want to go over between now and then. Watch this video up until right before our next class, but you are responsible for this material on the final exam. Oh, excuse me, on the second exam. So have a great break. Be safe. Get lots of rest. I hope you can actually take some time to relax. All right. Bye.